The stage was set in the town of Harlan Crossing on a Thursday morning in late October, when the cold had come down early and the cottonwoods along the creek had already given up their leaves. The auction yard sat at the north end of Main Street, and on that particular morning it held nearly every rancher within 20 miles, because the Greer estate was being liquidated. And there was good land attached to the name, and good land in that country was the kind of thing men woke before dawn to attend to. Nora Voss stood at the edge of the yard, with her hat in her hands and her chin at the level of a woman who has decided in advance not to fall apart. She was 31 years old, lean from a summer of working short-handed, with dark hair pinned back under a wool collar that had seen better winters. She had driven in before sunup with a proposition prepared, a number in her head, and what she believed was a reasonable case for a private arrangement before the bidding opened. She had asked to speak with the estate's appointed agent, a man named Dillard Pryce, who managed the books for 3 or 4 of the larger operations in the county, and who had, on 2 prior occasions, shaken her hand and called her a capable woman, which she had accepted at face value. Dillard Pryce listened to her for perhaps 90 seconds. Then he looked past her at the yard, filling with men, and said that the estate couldn't enter into private arrangements, that the haylots and the winter grazing lease would go to open bid, the same as everything else, and that she was welcome to compete like anyone. He said this without looking at her directly. He said it in the voice of a man explaining something to someone he does not expect to understand it fully. Then he moved away toward a cluster of ranchers near the fence, and Nora heard him say something she was not meant to hear, though she heard it plainly enough. He said that the Voss place had been running on borrowed time since her husband passed, and that he couldn't see how it lasted another season. She stood where she was for a moment. The yard was loud around her, boots on frozen ground, the smell of cattle and wood smoke, men calling to each other across the pens. She put her hat back on. She adjusted the brim the way she always did, 2 fingers, level. Then she walked to the far rail of the fence and stood there and watched the morning proceed. By the time the haylots came up for bid, she had her number ready. She bid twice. The third time the number climbed past what she had, she stopped. The lot went to a man named Caspar Holt, who owned the largest spread north of the creek and who did not need the hay the way she needed the hay, but who bought it because he could, and because in that country, having more than you needed was its own kind of argument. She was still at the rail when the bidding closed. She did not leave immediately. She stood and looked at the lot numbers chalked on the board and did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. Without that hay, she could not winter her cattle. Without wintering her cattle, she would sell at a loss in the next 6 weeks, or watch them through a hard season with feed she could not afford at any price. She had 23 cows, 8 of them with calves at heel, and a piece of land her husband's family had worked for 30 years, and she had gotten through the summer by being careful, and through the fall by being more careful still, and now she was at the end of careful. She was thinking this through, not dramatically but practically, the way you do when the problem is real and the time to think about it is short when a man appeared at the rail beside her. Not beside her exactly. Several feet down the rail, with his forearms resting on the top board and his eyes on the yard the same as hers. He was broad through the shoulders, in a canvas coat gone pale at the elbows, and he wore his hat low in the way of a man who is not performing anything. She had seen him at the auction before. His name was Cal Sutton. He ran cattle on the South Bench, a mid-sized operation, managed without hired hands most of the year. She knew him the way you know most people in a small county, which is to say she knew his name and his land and the rough shape of his reputation, which was that he was quiet and fair, and had not remarried after his wife died 4 years back. He did not look at her when he spoke. He said, "I have more hay than I can use this winter. I put up extra in July because I thought I'd expand the herd, and then I didn't." She looked at the board. He said, "I'm not trying to make anything of it. I'm just saying I have it, and you're standing here after that last bid, and I can do arithmetic." She said, "What would you want for it?" He said, "Half your calves come spring, or a fair price in cash, if you have it." She did not have it. He knew she did not have it. They both understood this without saying it. She said, "Half the calves." He said, "That's what I'm saying." She looked at him then. He was still looking at the yard. She said, "I'd want it in writing." He said, "That's fine." She said, "And I'd want the arrangement to run through branding season, so there's no question about what's mine and what's yours when the time comes." He said, "That's also fine." She put her hand out and he shook it, and that was the whole of it. A practical agreement between two people who needed different things and had found, for one winter, a way to balance them. That was all it was, and both of them understood it to be that, and neither of them said anything else. By the time the frost settled in for good, Nora had moved her herd to the south bench. The arrangement was that Cal would supply hay from his loft, and she would manage her cattle herself, coming to his land each morning to feed and check and do whatever the day required. She would use the small pasture on the east side of his fence line, which was sheltered from the north wind by a ridge of ponderosa pine, and she would not otherwise be in his way. That was how she thought of it. She would not be in his way. His place was larger than she had expected. Not large by the standards of the big outfits to the north, but solid, added to over years in the way of a man who plans ahead. A main house with a covered porch running the length of the south side, a barn that was well kept, a set of corrals that were level and tight. There was a bunkhouse that had not been used in some time, and a kitchen garden gone to frost, and a woodpile stacked so high and so square it looked like it had been built rather than accumulated. He had 2 children, a girl named Petra, who was 12, and a boy named Emmett, who was 6. Petra had her father's quality of stillness, and watched Nora from a careful distance for the first several days, not unfriendly, but not offering anything either. Emmett had no such reserve. On the second morning, he appeared at the pasture fence while Nora was breaking ice in the water trough, and watched her work with an expression of serious evaluation. He said, "You're strong for a lady." She said, "I've had practice." He said, "Papa says you're going to be here all winter." She said, "That's the plan." He thought about this. Then he said, "We had a dog that stayed for a winter once, and then it left in the spring." She said, "I have my own place to go back to." He nodded as if this confirmed something he had already suspected, and then he went back to the house, apparently satisfied. Petra came to the pasture on the 4th day. She did not come to speak. She came to watch, and Nora let her watch without making anything of it. Petra was at the age where being noticed too directly was a kind of insult, and Nora understood this from her own history and gave the girl room. On the 5th day, Petra handed her a fence staple she had dropped without being asked, and Nora said, "Thank you," and Petra said nothing. And that was the beginning of something, though neither of them named it as such. Cal Sutton said perhaps a dozen words to her in the first week. He was up before her each morning, which she discovered because the hay was already moved to the edge of the loft by the time she arrived, which saved her 20 minutes, and which he did not mention. And she did not thank him for, because she understood that thanking him would make it awkward in a way that would cause him to stop. She was not wrong about this. She had learned to read that particular kind of man from her husband, who had been a different version of the same type, and she knew that the help was the communication, and that talking about the help was beside the point. On the 9th day, she arrived to find a loose board on the pasture gate repaired. She had noticed the board herself the day before and had made a note to bring a hammer. She said nothing about it. He was in the barn when she passed, and he did not mention it either. Nothing said about the board. She said nothing about it either. And the gate swung true all winter after that. She was a good cook. She had not intended this to matter, But on the second week, when she arrived before her first light during a hard snap and found the house cold because the stove had gone out overnight, she built the fire back up and put coffee on and started breakfast because there were 2 children in that house, and the cold had been serious, and it seemed like the necessary thing. She had the eggs done and the bread sliced and the coffee poured by the time Cal came in from the barn, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table and then at her. She said, "The stove went out. I built it back." He said, "Thank you." He sat down and ate, and the children came in and ate, and Emmett said the eggs were very good, and Petra said nothing but ate 2 helpings, and that was that. After that morning, she started breakfast whenever she arrived before the household was up, which was most mornings, because she rose early by habit and the drive was short and the cold made starting early sensible. She told herself it was practical. It was practical. It was also something else that she did not examine closely. She had come from the Dalton County orphanage at 16, placed with a farm family who needed help and who had treated her fairly enough. And she had worked for wages until she was 22, when she married Thomas Voss, who was 10 years older and who had loved her plainly and well, and who had died of a fever in the 3rd year of a drought, leaving her the land and the cattle and the debt and the knowledge of how to manage all 3. She had managed them for 4 years alone. She was not a woman who asked for things. She was not a woman who expected them. She had learned early that the world did not arrange itself around what a person needed. And she had built her life accordingly, carefully, on what she could account for herself. She had not expected the children. Not the way Emmett appeared each morning with something to show her, a stone, a feather, a piece of wood he thought looked like a horse. Not the way Petra, by the 3rd week, began to simply exist near her without the earlier caution, sitting at the kitchen table while Nora worked, not talking but present in the way of someone who has decided a place is safe enough to be quiet in. She had not expected to find that easy. She found it easy. She had not expected Cal Sutton either, but she was not thinking about Cal Sutton. She was thinking about her cattle and her hay supply, and the cold, which had settled in hard and showed no sign of relenting. By the 2nd week of November, the temperature had dropped far enough that she was checking the herd twice a day, morning and evening, and on the evenings she sometimes did not leave until after supper, because supper was on the stove and the children were at the table, and it seemed rude to leave in the middle of a meal she had helped make. This was how she explained it to herself. She stayed for supper because leaving in the middle felt rude. Cal said, on one of those evenings, that she was welcome to use the spare room on the nights the cold was serious, rather than drive back on roads that iced after dark. He said it the way he said most things, plain and without decoration, and he said that it was a practical matter and that she should not read anything into the offer that was not there. She said she understood that, and that she appreciated it. She did not use the room that week. She used it the following Tuesday, when the temperature dropped to the kind of number that made the drive genuinely dangerous. And she slept in a room that smelled of cedar and old quilts, and woke before anyone else and started the stove. And the morning proceeded the same as any other morning, which was exactly as it should be. Emmett found her in the kitchen that morning and sat down at the table and watched her work with the expression he always wore, which was one of complete and unself-conscious attention. He said, "You make the coffee different than Papa does." She said, "How does your Papa make it?" He said, "Strong. Yours is also strong, but it tastes better." She said, "That's a serious assessment." He said, "Burnt beans are a serious matter. I don't take them lightly." The corner of her mouth moved once and returned to where it had been. He said, "Are you going to stay here?" She said, "I'm here through the winter, like we talked about." He said, "I mean, after." She looked at the pot. She said, "I have my own place, Emmett." He thought about this for a long time. Then he said, "Okay," and went to get dressed. And she stood at the stove and felt something move through her that she set aside, deliberately, the way you move a thing to a high shelf because the floor is not the place for it. It was Petra who broke her open, though that is not the right word for it, because nothing broke. It was more like something that had been held very still for a long time was allowed, briefly, to be still in a different way. It happened on a Saturday in late November, during a lull in the cold when the light came back for a few hours and the whole bench looked pale gold and clean. Nora was in the barn checking a cow that had been off her feed, and Petra came in and stood at the stall door and watched, and after a while, she said, in the careful voice of someone asking something they have been thinking about for some time, she said, "Did you have children? Of your own?" Nora said, "No. My husband and I didn't have that chance." Petra said, "Do you wish you had?" Nora looked at the cow. She said, "I used to think about it. I don't think about it the same way anymore." Petra was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My mother used to make a thing with dried apples and cinnamon. I can't remember how she did it." "I've been trying to remember." Nora said, "I know how to make that. Know how to make. If you want, I could show you." Petra looked at her. Not the careful watching look she had worn in the first days. Something more open than that, and more fragile. She said, "Okay." And she went back to the house, and Nora finished with the cow and followed her, and they spent the afternoon in the kitchen with dried apples and a cinnamon stick and a cast-iron pan, and Petra paid close attention to every step. And by the time Cal came in from the corrals, the whole house smelled of it. He stood in the doorway. He looked at the pan on the stove and at his daughter's face, and at Nora standing at the counter with flour on her sleeve. Something moved across his face that he set aside, but not quite quickly enough. And Nora saw it and looked away, and neither of them said anything about it. And supper was a quieter meal than usual, but not an uncomfortable one. That was the Saturday in late November. After that, something had shifted in the house, though nothing had been said, and nothing had been asked, and nothing had been offered. It was simply that the quality of the quiet between them changed. It was not the quiet of two people being careful around each other. It was the quiet of two people who had stopped needing to be. He left coffee on the counter for her on the morning she arrived before he came in from the barn. Not set out, exactly. Just there. Poured. Still hot. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. She drank it and started breakfast, and the morning went on. She noticed that he had begun to wait for her before he started the evening check of the herd. Not visibly waiting, just not starting. So that when she came to the barn in the evening, he was there, ready, and they did the check together, walking the pasture in the last light. And he would say what he had noticed during the day, and she would say what she had noticed that morning, and between the two of them, they had a complete picture of the herd, which was efficient and sensible, and also the best part of her day, which she acknowledged to herself and did not examine further. Word travels in a small town the way weather does, low and fast and ahead of itself. By December, Harlan Crossing had a version of the arrangement at the Sutton place, and like most versions that travel that way, it was not quite accurate and not quite wrong. The version that traveled was that the Voss widow had moved herself into the Sutton household, which was not true, and that she had done so by design, which was also not true, and that Cal Sutton was too soft-hearted to put a stop to it, which was so far from the truth that it would have been funny if it had not been the kind of thing that could do damage. The woman who carried the version most efficiently was named Doris Pell, who ran the dry goods counter at the general store and who had a voice built for distance and a concern for others that she kept prepared at home and brought out fresh each morning. Doris Pell had decided early in the season that the Voss woman was a particular kind of problem, the kind that attached itself to a man's household through his children, and she said so to anyone who came to the counter and did not immediately change the subject. What Doris Pell did not know and would not have considered relevant if she had, was that Nora Voss had been keeping a careful account of every pound of hay used, every meal cooked, every fence board repaired, and intended to settle the account in full come spring, in calves or in labor or in whatever form was fair, because she had never in her life taken something she had not earned, and she was not going to begin now. What Doris Pell also did not know was that Dillard Pryce, the estate agent who had dismissed Nora at the October auction, had been making inquiries about the Voss land, not openly, through a third party, a man named Garvey who bought and held parcels, and who had a way of appearing near a distressed property the way certain birds appear near a dying thing. Pryce had an interest in the Voss land because it sat adjacent to a water right he had been trying to consolidate for 2 years, and a woman alone, running short on options, was in his estimation the right kind of seller. He had not approached her directly. He was waiting for the spring to make her desperate enough. He did not know that she had made it through the winter. The thing that brought it into the open happened on a Friday in January, which was a market day in Harlan Crossing, and which meant that most of the ranching families within driving distance came to town for supplies and news and the particular social accounting that small communities conduct on a regular basis. Nora had come for flour and lamp oil and a new bolt for the pasture gate, and she was at the dry goods counter when Doris Pell said, in the voice she used when she wanted to be heard by more than one person, that she supposed the Sutton children must be getting attached, which was a shame, given that these arrangements never lasted, and that a man like Cal Sutton deserved better than to be taken advantage of by a woman in a difficult position who had nowhere else to go. The store was not empty. There were 4 other women at the counter and 2 men near the door, and the boy who swept the floor, who had stopped sweeping. Nora set down the bolt she had been examining. She said, "I have a written agreement with Cal Sutton for hay and winter pasture in exchange for half my calf crop in the spring. I have kept that agreement. I have also cooked meals and repaired fence and done work that was not in the agreement because it was the right thing to do in a household where I was a guest. If you have a concern about the terms of a business arrangement between 2 adults, I'd suggest you take it up with one of us directly." She picked up the bolt. She said, "I'll take this and the flour and the lamp oil." Doris Pell said nothing. The store was very quiet. Nora paid and left. She drove back to the bench in the cold and did the evening check and fed the cattle, and went inside and started supper, and did not say anything about it. She had said what needed saying, and she did not need to say it again. She did not know that Cal Sutton had been at the feed store 2 doors down, and had heard the account from 3 different people before he had finished loading his truck. She did not know this because he did not tell her. He came home and ate supper and helped Emmett with his letters and said good night to Petra and sat by the stove for a while after the children were in bed, and Nora was at the table going over her accounts, and he looked at the back of her head for a long time, and then he went to bed. She did not know what he was thinking. She did not ask. What she did not know, and what the town did not know, and what Dillard Pryce had not accounted for when he made his quiet inquiries, was that Cal Sutton had spent the better part of January looking at the Voss land records at the county office, not because he had any interest in acquiring it, because he had noticed, in a conversation she did not know he had been paying attention to, that she had mentioned a drainage problem on the east pasture that had been getting worse for 2 years, and he had a thought about how to address it, and he wanted to understand the land before he said anything about it. He had said nothing about it yet. He was still thinking. It was Dillard Pryce who came to the ranch. He came on a Tuesday morning in February, when the cold had eased enough to make the roads passable, and he drove up in a good truck and got out and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand in the way of a man who has decided to be pleasant. He asked for Nora Voss. Cal told him she was in the pasture. Pryce said he would wait. He waited in the yard. Cal did not invite him inside. When Nora came up from the pasture, she saw the truck, and then she saw Pryce, and she understood immediately why he was there. because she had been expecting something like this since October. And because she had done her own accounting and she knew what her land looked like on paper to a man who read land the way Pryce did. Pryce said he had heard she'd had a hard winter and that he wanted to make sure she knew her options. He said there were people who would be interested in the Voss land at a fair price and that she wouldn't need to go through the auction, that it could be handled quietly and to her benefit. He said this with the manner of a man doing a favor. She said, "My land is not for sale." He said that he understood that and that sometimes circumstances changed and that the offer would remain open. She said, "I heard you the first time." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cal, who was standing at the barn door with his arms at his sides, not moving, not speaking, just present in the way of a man who was not going anywhere. Pryce looked back at Nora. He put his hat on. He got in his truck and drove back down the road. Cal said, "Has he been at you before?" She said, "Not directly. I've been expecting it." He said, "You don't have to handle that alone." She said, "I know." She went back to the pasture. He went back to the barn. That was all that was said, and it was enough. The following Saturday, Cal drove to the county seat. He was gone most of the day. He came back with a set of papers that he set on the kitchen table after supper, after the children were in bed, and he sat down across from her and said he wanted to show her something. The papers were a proposal for a drainage easement on the east pasture of the Voss land, properly drawn up, that would address the water problem she had mentioned, and that would, as a secondary effect, make the land's recorded value substantially clearer and more defensible against any future claims or pressure. He had had a surveyor look at it. He had paid for the survey himself. She looked at the papers for a long time. She said, "Why did you do this?" He said, "Because the problem is solvable, and because Pryce is going to come back, and you should have your land in order." She said, "That's not a small thing to do for someone." He said, "No." He was quiet. She was quiet. The stove ticked. He said, "I want to say something, and I want to say it plain, and I want you to know that whatever you say back, nothing changes here. The arrangement stands. The calves are yours to divide as agreed, and you can stay through branding season the same as we said." She looked at him. He said, "I am asking you to stay permanent. As my wife, if that's what you'd want, not because of the land or the children, though both of those things are true and I won't pretend otherwise, because this winter has been the first winter in a long time that felt like something was right in this house. And I think you know what I mean by that." He said, "You don't have to answer now. You don't have to answer at all if the answer is no. I mean that." He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. He said, "That's all I wanted to say." She looked at his hands on the table. She thought about the coffee left on the counter in the mornings. She thought about the gateboard, repaired without comment. She thought about Petra at the stove with dried apples and cinnamon, and the look on her face when she got the proportion right. She thought about Emmett and the stone and the feather and the piece of wood that looked like a horse. She thought about the evening checks, walking the pasture in the last light, and how between the two of them they had a complete picture, and how that had been, without her planning it, the best part of every day for 3 months. She had not planned any of this. She had come with a number in her head and a practical proposition, and the intention of getting through a hard winter and returning to her own land in the spring. She had not planned to find that a place could feel like the right size for a person, or that a silence could be the kind you did not want to leave. She said, "Yes." He looked up. She said, "That's what I want." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that he did not set aside this time. Then he nodded once, the way he did when something was settled, and he picked up the drainage papers and squared them on the table. And she got up and put the coffee on, and the stove ticked, and the wind moved against the windows, and the house held its warmth around them. By the time the branding season came, the herd was one herd, not by any formal declaration. It had simply happened the way most true things happen in that country, gradually and then all at once, so that by the time anyone thought to name it, it had already been the case for some time. They branded in late April, when the light came back long and the bench was green for the first time since October, and the calves were strong and the cows were in good condition, and the winter that had seemed, in October, like the kind that could undo a person, had instead done something else entirely. Cal's hands came to help, 2 men from the neighboring place, and they worked through the morning in the good practical way of people who know what they are doing, and by noon the work was done, and there was food on the table on the porch, and the children were in the yard, and the day was the kind of day that makes a person feel, briefly, that the accounting has come out right. Emmett sat beside Nora at the table and showed her a calf he had decided to name Thursday, for reasons he explained at length and which had to do with the day of the week on which the calf had been born. And Nora said that Thursday was a fine name for a calf. And Emmett said he thought so too. Petra sat across from them and ate and did not say much, but once when Nora passed the bread, their eyes met and Petra smiled, quickly, the way she did, and Nora smiled back. And that was the whole of it, and it was enough. Dillard Pryce did not come back to the ranch. He did not approach Nora about the Voss land again. The drainage easement had been filed at the county office in February, and the land's record was clean and clear, and there was nothing to press against. He was still in Harlan Crossing, still managing books for the larger outfits, and he said nothing when he saw her in town, which was as close to an apology as such a man gives, and she accepted it as such and moved on. Doris Pell, for her part, had stopped saying things at the dry goods counter. She had not said anything since January. The town had watched and stored up what it saw, and what it saw was a woman who had stood at the dry goods counter and spoken plainly, and paid for her flour and her lamp oil and her bolt and left without drama. And the town had, in its slow collective way, adjusted its account of her accordingly. By spring, when she came to town as Cal Sutton's wife, the adjustment was complete. And the women at the counter were pleasant, and one of them said she had heard the Sutton place was looking well this year, and Nora said it was, and that was the end of that. The Voss land was not sold, it was kept. Cal had thoughts about the east pasture, practical thoughts involving drainage and a good stand of grass that could be had with one season's work, and they talked about it in the evenings the way they talked about most things, plainly and with attention. And the plan was made, and the work would be done, and the land would be what it had always had the capacity to be, which was enough. The cedar chest that had been in the spare room was moved to the main bedroom. Inside it was a cloth she had brought from her own house, a piece of blue wool that had belonged to her mother, or so she had been told, because she had been too young to remember her mother directly, and had only the cloth as evidence. She had carried it from the orphanage to the farm family, to the Voss place, and now here, and she had not taken it out of the chest in some years, because there had not seemed to be a reason. She took it out in April and put it on the back of the chair by the window, where the morning light came through, and it stayed there. And the color of it in that light was something she had not expected, a blue that was warmer than she remembered. Or perhaps the light was different here. Or perhaps she was. Emmett came in one morning and saw it and said, "That's pretty." She said, "It was my mother's." He said, "Can I touch it?" She said, "Yes." He touched it carefully, with one finger, the way he touched things he considered important. Then he went out to find his father, and she heard him in the yard, his voice carrying in the bright April morning, and she stood at the window for a moment with the light on her face and the cloth on the chair behind her, and the bench was green below the ridge, and the cattle were moving in the pasture, and the day was beginning the way days begin when there is work to do and people to do it with, and a place that is the right size for a person. The cabin held its warmth, not waiting for anyone, not any more. And that was the story of Nora Voss and Cal Sutton, a woman who arrived at an auction yard with nothing but a number in her head and a chin held level, and who left the winter with everything that actually matters. Let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this one. Thank you.